I do believe that's me. I am Annie Elizabeth Livingston Saunders Hardin, but you can call me Annie. I was born in 1850. Well, a lady never tells her age. Let's just say I look good. I grew up with a mama and a papa, and contrary to popular gossip, my papa was from the Georgia Livingstons. Senator Livingston, L.F. Livingston, he was my first cousin. And Mama, God rest her soul, she was a proper Irish Catholic. Anyway, Papa died when I was very young of the fever. And it was just Mama and baby sister and I. Mama met another gentleman and married, and my life was filled with half-siblings. It was a happy time. Many people have asked me how I met my dear Sydney. That's a wonderful story. I was walking home from church one day when I noticed this handsome young gentleman decked out in a Confederate uniform. Well, to be polite, I nodded my hellos as I was passing. He had the audacity to wink at me. Well, I thought, how forward. Well, to show my displeasure, I put my nose in the air and proceeded to walk past. He just laughed at me and told me I was a saucy young thing. Well, I was highly offended, but I must admit I was a little bit intrigued. Soon he became one of my gentlemen callers, and we were at all the social functions, all the dances and the parties, and he sat beside me at Sunday school. It was a happy time. We were so in love. Soon I found myself with child, which just wasn't done back then, but we didn't care. Oh, the gossip went wild when my dear little Willie was born. William St. John. He was born in 1873. And a year later, Sydney asked me to be his wife. We ran away to St. Louis, and that's where we were married. We come back to Monroe. People were gossiping. We ignored them. They had the audacity to call me a soiled dove. They said I was a lady of the evening that he picked up. We weren't really married. And that my dear Sydney was making his money off of prostitution. Why, Mrs. Smith was running a ladies' boarding house. It's not a house of prostitution. Anyway, like I said, we ignored the gossip. We were just so in love. Then came May of 1886, and Willie got sick. He took his last breath in my arms. I was inconsolable. A year later, Sydney took me on a trip to California to take my mind off of things. It was a sad time. Our life became happy again, but not quite as happy as we once were. Back in 1871, when Sydney and I were still dating, there had been a fire that started in one of Sydney's buildings, and it was quickly ruled an accident. It did a lot of damage in Monroe, but everyone knew it was an accident. A carelessly lit candle was too close to a curtain. Well, like I said, everyone knew it was an accident. But 1889, just 3 or 4 years after we had lost Willie, another fire began at one of Sydney's buildings. Burned down Monroe, did about $12,000 worth of damage. This time, they didn't say it was an accident. They said Sydney said it deliberately, and I know that's not true. He was out with me that night. There's no way he could have set that fire. They didn't listen. They didn't listen. They drug him off to jail. They put him on trial. His lawyers got a continuance saying he was mentally and physically unable to stand trial. I knew that. I watched him pacing back and forth, mumbling about his problems. He was afraid he was going to be lynched with good reason. That rag, the Ouachita Telegraph newspaper, published an article in the paper detailing my Sydney's trial, of course. But right next to it were the meeting minutes of a group of local concerned citizens in Monroe, in veiled terms. By the way, the committee was chaired by that drunkard Fred Endom. Basically, they passed resolutions in veiled terms threatening to lynch my Sydney. They said, if you don't do something, they were talking to the lawyers and the judges, if you don't do something, we will. How could any civilized... Anyway, again, Sydney was afraid of being lynched, with good reason. I didn't know it, but behind my back, he went and bought a plot at the city cemetery. A few days later, I walked into our room, and he was on the ground with a bullet wound to the back of the head. He was gasping. There was blood everywhere. I picked his head up and placed it in my lap, and I screamed, and I screamed, and I screamed, and they came running, and the doctor was called for, but he took his last breath in my arms. Oh, so much blood, so much blood. I was covered in it. I was inconsolable, out of my mind with grief. But that gossip was still going on in Monroe that said that we were never married. Malicious gossip. His brothers and sisters believed those lies, and they swooped in on me and demanded proof of our marriage. Well, I was so grief-stricken that they understood my ramblings as saying that we were married in New Orleans. Well, of course, they went to New Orleans. They didn't find any proof. Aha! You don't get anything. My Sydney was worth about $83,000. Back then, that was a lot of money. Well, they started parceling out his inheritance. Well, I came out of my grief long enough to say, no, we were married in St. Louis. I sent a courier north, and proof was found. They deemed me worthy of about 8% of the inheritance, $7,500, and a little bit of property in Texarkana. By rights, I should have gotten half. Well, I put that money to good use. The gossip had not died. They still claimed that I had cheated his siblings somehow. Well, I had the monument built. Now, the statue on top of the grave is not an exact likeness. It's one of the employees of the monument company. My Sydney was much more handsome than that, but it's close enough. And in his hand, he has a scroll. Written upon that scroll for all eternity to see is an exact copy of our marriage license. And it stares towards where the prominent members of Monroe society had gossiped about us behind our fans. There it is. I wanted this to be an eternal slap in the face to those who had talked about us. Now, while this was being built, I just couldn't bear being away from my Sydney. So I had his coffin put in our shed back of the house. You know, Monroe thought I was crazy for that. The children and some of the adults would cross the street to keep from walking on the same side of the road as where my Sydney lay. I was in grief. I couldn't bear being away from him. But once the monument was built, I had his body placed in the tomb, and I had Willie placed there. I put Sydney's desk and chair inside, my son's velocipede and his little red wagon. And I even hung curtains to make it a little less dreary. And there I sat at the desk and would pray and cry and read my Bible. I even had a sewing machine down there. I'd do a little sewing. And there I stayed for many, many years. By the way, after that monument was built, one of the ladies, the elite Monroe society, continued to gossip in her diary. She wrote, and I can almost see her nose going up in the air, "Sid Saunders, the firebug, has a monument that would almost do for a U.S. president. How dare Martha Frances Surgener say that about my Sidney? Firebug. Well, I poured out my grief on the outside of the monument. Among the verses is this one. They declared him a suicide. They declared Sidney a suicide. I wrote on the outside, Sidney, I could have well forgiven that last seemingly cruel act of thine, for you wanted me with you in heaven, had you with your life taken mine. Trembling and alone I tread life's weary strand, beset by envy and strife. But mid it all, in God, in love of thee, has stayed my hand to raise this marble to thy memory. And there I wept for many, many years. Oh, William Hardin, he was my second husband. Yes, I was First Lady of Texarkana. Thank you very much. But sad to say, William deserted me and divorced me behind my back. Well, I fought them. I had to fight the brothers and sisters again, a second go round. Well, I won. 2 weeks before I died. Oh, dear God, I remember flames, I remember pain, unending pain, and then nothingness. Oh, good. They buried me by Sidney and Willie.
Oh, my dear.